So thank you again. I like to start this talk. I've given various versions of this, as Todd mentioned. But thank you for being here, right? Thank you for caring about open source software. Thank you for caring about its security, because caring about it, I think, is half the battle. It's a good place to start anyway. So this is we're going back to basics. This is a talk for everybody, especially security novices. So let's talk about why are we here again? What are we doing? So why is open source security so challenging? What is it that makes it different in some way? So we're community driven, right? And what are communities made of? Not P. Communities are made out of people. People that come together to make the software that we all depend so heavily on. And they're usually quite distributed all over the world, multiple different companies and organizations, ideally, we'll get to that. And developer identity is an interesting question. I kind of, we were hinting at it earlier in our conversation, but how you kind of control who contributes and the code that comes in and all of those things, it's a complicated thing. I like to say, I'm not going to say that writing good code is easy, but code might be the easier part of open source community. It's the human interaction and the collaboration that actually tends to be a little bit even more challenging. So here are some stats. You might have heard these elsewhere in this conference already, but it doesn't hurt to remind ourselves, right? There was a synopsis report in 2023 that showed that 96% of the software packages that they surveyed for their study contained open source software. And then within those code bases, 77% of the code, the actual code that made up the projects, it was open source. And you get similar numbers from the Linux Foundation, too. So, you hear it from enough people and we start to believe it, right? And we all know it to be true. We were doing this kind of work. It's everywhere. So we won, right? Now what? Now what do we do? I don't know how many of you have been around. I've been around for quite a while in the open source community, and I used to have these conversations about, I remember my favorite story. Somebody told somebody who was pitching an open source platform to a big enterprise organization, and a guy told the guy, it kind of seems like coding with your pants down. And I thought, maybe, but at least you got to keep it clean then. So maybe I am funny. Thank you for laughing at my jokes. But it was a true story. Somebody said those words, so here's my friend Josh Bressers, and any of you know him, he's involved in open source, OpenSSF somewhat. He wrote a great blog post, and I linked to it. That's the link. The NPM ecosystem is a really great example of the kind of challenges the open source community faces. There's a massive, massive proliferation of projects. There's just there are a lot of projects, a lot of code, and a lot of people writing that code. There are more and more developers entering open source projects, entering the open source community. GitHub produced a study that showed last year there was over 20% increase in new open source contributors. That is fantastic. But what that means is graphs like these. It's kind of overwhelming. They hit 1 million in 2019, and not so many years later, it was 3.6. I don't even know what it's at today. Tremendous, right? And then each new package is going to have, many versions eventually, and you get kind of a picture of how massive the ecosystem is. And then here's another challenge. We really have to consider how many projects are not well-supported things like maybe Kubernetes or projects that have an extensive set of governance. A lot of projects out there are maintained by one person, just one, maybe two, maybe a small group, but that's the reality that we are in right now. So here, let's talk about just briefly about CVEs, right? CVEs are not uniquely open source, right? But CVEs also massively on the rise, and we just saw how prevalent open source software is. So here's, another challenge, kind of throw in a wrench into things, something to consider. But does this mean that software is less secure as a result? No, not really. There's so much of it. So how could we help but have so many more vulnerabilities? So here's another challenge, right, that we like to talk about. So many dependencies. Now, Dan just kind of mentioned this a little bit, but I wanted to reiterate too. Web applications too can get way up there, and this is a pretty dependency graph. Thank you, Ryan Ware, my buddy, for sharing this image with me, because this always gets a bit of a chuckle. But this is how bad it can get. This is from Gatsby, and I'll just kind of zoom in so you can see what it really looks like. But this is a picture of the kind of things we're facing, and how can we possibly keep tabs on all of this? So what I want to talk about, what does it mean to consume open source software securely? So I'm really talking about from the perspective of somebody creating my own project. And I know that when we're going out there and finding libraries and packages and things that solve a lot of our problems, somebody's done it for us. It's like free candy, and it's really exciting. And I can just include them in my project, and it's fantastic. But there are some really important considerations when we think about what we choose to ingest. So here's a question I want to ask all of you, right? When you're evaluating an open source project to include in your own, what do you look at? What's a good thing to start with? Just really quickly. You can't. Number of issues. Okay, one more.
Do I really need this?
Oh, that's a good one. That is a good one. Yeah. Well, we'll get to my rant about that in a sec. So I like to think, we need to do a few things, right? We need to review its basic health. We need to check the governance. What's that mean, right? We need to review the maintenance and releases. We need to see what kind of cadence that's happening on. We need to check out the community behind it, the people, the actual humans making that software, right? And we need to see the bug reporting process. And then, like Krob said, we probably want to just run OpenSSF scorecard. But we're all here, and I encourage you to learn more about that, and I'm going to mention it again in a minute. But let's talk about basic health again. Somebody mentioned issues. Do we really need it? How about this one? Does the project have a maintainer? This one, thank you. Is Ryan here? I don't know. Ryan Rare actually pointed this out to me a while ago, that how many projects just don't even have maintainers anymore? They're abandoned. Somebody was working on them. It served a purpose for them in the past, but you don't have time to work on it. This is not an uncommon scenario, and this is pretty important to check out, right? So is it even maintained? Unmaintained software is a big risk.
By the way, it's also possible if you look at the name, sometimes maintainers have died.
Yeah, yes. Definitely do not use a project without living maintainers. So here's another one, right? Again, we looked at the issue queue. If the last issue was reported 10 years ago, or the last commit was 10 years ago, or the last pull request, the last activity 10 years ago, big red flag. So we want to look at the issue queue. We want to look at the commits. We want to see that there's activity, right? When was the last response to an issue even? If somebody raises an issue, how long does it take for the maintainer to respond to that? Where are we? Anyway, issue queues. So what's the next thing? What's an easy way to look at basic health of a project? Isn't it great that we have a community making tools for this? Here's a really easy way. This is some kind of low-hanging fruit. So yeah, the best practices badge is something that can help you quickly assess the basic health of a project. So that's step one, ticked really nicely. And it will allow you to kind of drill in and see what might be missing to get to the next level of basic security compliance with best practices. The other thing I mentioned a second ago, right, governance. Well, we talked a little bit about this, right? Dan set me up for a really nice to drive this point home. But licensing is actually really important to security. A lot of people ask me, like, that's not, the code. Like, how is that making the project less secure? Well, the absence of a license is a huge red flag, right? That means that people just are not paying attention to their project. A good project and a secure project requires care and feeding and thoughtfulness. And the presence of an open source license is an indicator of that, right? But you want to see other types of governance, rules, customs. How do decisions get made? How many maintainers are there? Are they from more than one organization? That all goes to governance of a project, and that's an important thing to consider. Another one that you want to see, maintenance and release processes, right? Is it documented? Has there been some substantial release activity in the past year? Are there regularly occurring releases? Are there patch releases? Are releases being made to address security concerns? Here's another one. Does the project have a blog or communicate with users in any way? That is interestingly an indicator of project health and therefore project security. Is the latest release a beta? I mean, I've used them before, but you have to understand going into it that you're going to need a little bit more care and feeding of your own when you decide to ingest a project in that state. Here's another one, right? Community engagement. Is this a security question? It actually kind of is, right? Because the community is responsible for keeping things like bugs fixed, dependencies up to date. The community, the maintainers of any project are relying heavily on a community to help them with all of these tasks. So the other thing we want to look at is their contributor documentation. A healthy community, again, is going to have a documented process. Even if there's just anything here, a contributor.nd file, that is an indicator of something. It's better to have one than not, for sure. We also want to look at and see if a project is extensively used, right? You want to see, you don't want to be the only person using somebody's hobby project. Here's another one that's definitely worth considering, right? And this is, does the project have a secure bug reporting process? This is, of course, Kubernetes is going to be very well documented, and larger projects are going to tend to have extensive documentation, but does it have any documentation for how to report a bug securely? Again, an indicator that you might want to look for. That one's from Mastodon, but it's quite a bit shorter, but it's still there, right? So that's a good sign. So another thing, I wanted to talk just really quickly. I hinted at some of the tools earlier, but we have a community coming together to give us tools to quickly deal with all of that kind of assessment that we just talked about. Yes, we always have to do our due diligence, but the tools, adding tools to our workflow will help with this, right? One of them I wanted to quickly mention is something made by a lovely woman named Terry Oda at Intel, and that's something called CVE bin tool. It's a binary scanner, right? So you can scan binaries for known vulnerabilities, very handy tool. Another one that I've mentioned, and I really encourage everyone to check out a little bit more in depth, and there are sessions, I think later today, devoted to talking about Scorecard and its future. But Scorecard is absolutely fantastic. It helps automate a lot of these manual checks that I just talked about, right? It checks for things like repo activity, maintainer status. In other words, are there maintainers from multiple organizations? It checks for things like the presence of a license and just all sorts of basic stuff, and a lot of more advanced stuff. Very handy. Highly encourage you to check it out. And you can just run it on the command line, by the way. You can include it in your workflow, right? GitHub Actions and some other things that are in the works, as I understand it. But you can when you're evaluating a project to include in your own, you can run a quick command and find out the status and the score of a project that you want to include. I don't, unfortunately, think I have time to go into debate about what's a good score and whatnot, but I will say it's probably going to depend on your use case and your organization. Another thing I wanted to very quickly mention is S2C2F. This is a fantastic resource for end users and consumers of open source software. There's extensive documentation, references to many tools, and it doesn't assume perfection, right? The key thing here, multiple levels. You've got to start somewhere. Check it out. Given that we're all here for a reason, I don't really feel like I need to go through this one too much. But again, thank you for being here. The fact that you're here means we want to contribute to this conversation, and I really appreciate it. So I wanted to leave you with this thought, though, and that is, at the end of the day, in the open source community, developers don't necessarily owe you anything. They may if you employ them, fine. If you have a contractual relationship, they might owe you something. But given, again, we swim in a very large pool. And most of the developers working on most of the projects that we depend on to run everything we do don't directly owe us anything. So when we ingest open source projects any kind of code written by someone else who doesn't owe us anything, we have to understand that we take ownership of that project at that point. When you are using it, you own it. You're responsible for making sure, keeping tabs on all of the things we discussed. All of those things need to happen, and it's on you. And we can't keep pointing fingers at the developers and the maintainers, because at the end of the day, we are getting a lot of value from that, and we have to take ownership. So I am, unfortunately, I believe, out of time, but here's where to reach me if you need to listen to any more fun jokes about pants or my podcast. So thank you, everyone.